Welcome to the first episode of the Forest Restoration Talks, organized jointly by SUPERB, Horizon Europe 2020 funded project on forest ecosystem restoration in Europe, and IUFRO Task Force, Transforming Forest Landscape for Future Climate and Human Well-Being. The objective of this series of webinars is to investigate forest restoration questions from diverse scientific perspectives, with alternating focus on the global and European levels. The series brings together researchers, practitioners, NGO, policymakers, and other interested stakeholders to explore practical forest restoration approach, experience, and challenges worldwide. Today's episode is entitled European Forest Restoration Urgently Needed, but Where and How? Unlike the former webinars, we will not have one speaker today. We will rather have 4 speakers and our moderator. And you will try to answer this question. So myself, I'm Magda Buda-Gerkarat. I'm the coordinator of SUPERB project. And my colleague Gert-Jan, who will moderate this session today, will introduce the panelist, and he is the co-coordinator of SUPERB. But before introducing Gert-Jan, let me make some housekeeping announcements. So this webinar is recorded. The recording will be available to watch on EFI YouTube channel and on IUFRO website. For questions after the panelist intervention, please put them in Q&A dedicated box. And after this, we may give you the floor to ask your question live, and Priscilla or Gabby will give you the floor to do this. And if you are tweeting about this webinar, please don't forget to tag IUFRO or SUPERB project. So now I will introduce Gert-Jan. So Gert-Jan Nabuurs is a professor of European forest resources at Wageningen University and Research. His expertise is European scale forest resource analysis, carbon sequestration under climate change. He is an IPCC coordinating lead author in the 6th assessment report for agriculture and forestry. Gert-Jan is co-coordinating SUPERB project and is leading the work package 7 on demo cases. So Gert-Jan, I give you the floor and welcome our other speakers.
Thank you very much, Magda, for this very nice introduction. And I will quickly proceed with the seminar introduction. As Magda said, we will have 4 esteemed speakers today, and you see them here on the list. First, Professor Jürgen Bauhus from University of Freiburg, then Harald Mauser from the Liaison Office in Brussels of the European Forest Institute, then Iciar Alberdi from Iciar in Madrid will continue, and Sara Filipek, researcher from Wageningen, environmental research in Wageningen, will finalize the talks. And then, yes, next, please. So I will fall right into the topic of this webinar, and I'll forward this in with a picture. Here you see a picture of black pine in the south of the Netherlands on dry, poor sandy soils. And so, does this need restoration? What would you? And you would probably say yes when you see such a stand, which fulfills certain functions, but maybe does not fulfill other functions, and is certainly different than the natural habitat there. Yes, next. But the question becomes more difficult when you look at this picture. This is mid-Finland, where a forest owner is carrying out a final harvest. This is closer to its natural habitat, but maybe not very close either. It gives a different aspect, a different flavor of the picture. So would this need restoration, according to you? It's already more difficult. Yes, next. And here we look at a picture from Scotland, continuous cover forestry. Well, you might know Scotland from even-aged Sitka spruce plantations, but there are also sites like this where continuous cover forestry is already employed for several decades. Here are mixtures of fir and spruce and a bit of beech as well. So this gives a totally different view in our human eyes, but it may not even be that different from a more even age stand. So what do we gain here in terms of biodiversity? Is it much closer to the natural habitat? But what do we also lose in terms of maybe some productivity, but also it's a more complex management system, which will require much more from the forest owner to manage this. He or she has to carry out manual felling with a chainsaw with these enormous trees. It's also much more complex. So it's all aspects of that are related to when you change your management, when you try to restore forests. Yes, please. And if we ask us the question, do we need forest restoration and where do we need it first and how? Then also we need to look at, do we actually know where it is needed? And you may know this, the kind of reporting that countries do to the European Environment Agency, the habitats reporting, what they do. Also, forest habitats are being reported to the EDA, and Harald Mauser will go into that in much more detail. But in the end, the reporting then results in a rather simple color scheme, I would say, red, orange, and green, where red is a bad status. So what does this then, what you see here on the right for the Atlantic forest in Atlantic oak forest in Europe? Is it all really in a bad shape? Does it all need this restoration? Does it all need the same attention and effort? So this is what we will try to address as well in the webinar. Yes, please. And if we change our management, it also has an impact on available resources. Here you see empty shelves of where there's supposed to be toilet paper. Will we run into resource shortages if we drastically change our management? Those are questions as well that we need to address in restoration. Yes, please. So these are some of the questions we will address. Restoration, yes, but in which direction? Is it strict set aside? Is it cultural historical management? Is it with enhanced wood production or less wood production? And in which goal do we want to go? Jürgen Bauhus will especially go into that. Do we know the science behind it, the restoration plans that are needed? How do we set them up? What are benefits to the local communities or less benefits, reduced benefits? And Sara will also address that. What are the cost-effective choices of the locations? Do we know the locations, as I said? Are the measures, will they be permanent? Will they have a permanent effect? And how do we assess the current status and the future goals? And this is what Iciar Alberdi will go into. Do we know from the National Forest Inventories, do we know enough to say something about this? Yes, please. So this is the program, now with a bit more detail. So Jürgen will kick off. What does forest restoration mean in Europe? What is the concept? And Harald Mauser takes over with comments on these methods of how forest habitat status is currently assessed in Europe. Iciar will then take over with the National Forest Inventories. Do they assess restoration needs sufficiently? And then last, Sara will take over. What are the challenges related to restoration measures? She will show examples from the SUPERB and how the demo areas are taking shape. And then we will have a panel discussion, rather short, I would say, but in the meantime, also Q&As can be posted in the chat. And Q&As will be selected by some of our colleagues. And then you also have the option to, you will be selected, and then you have the option also to mingle in the discussion, partly in the panel as well. Yep, next, please. And yes, next. And then it's up to Jürgen.
Yeah, thank you, Gert-Jan, also for the introduction, and hello from my side here from Freiburg. Spring has not broken out yet, as you can see, so the background is not that timely, but it shows also, you know, the object of restoration, a typical habitat type for Europe. I want to use the next 10 minutes really to introduce you to sort of the understanding and concept of restoration that we aim to apply in the SUPERB project. What do we mean by restoration? There's a plethora of definitions, but I would like to start with the one that is sorry, there was a little mistake here. I want to use the one that is being used in the proposed law for restoration of nature. Next slide, please. So it's a bit of text here that requires careful reading for understanding. So in this EU proposal for regulation on nature restoration, it says restoration means the process of actively or passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystem towards or to good condition of a habitat type to the highest level of condition attainable and to its favorable reference area of a habitat of a species to a sufficient quality and quantity, or of species populations to satisfactory levels as a means of conserving or enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. So it's quite a mouthful, and you have to read it a few times, and it's not as simple. But I would like to point out a few key concepts that are important. Next slide, please. So good condition is a critical concept here. And again, it's described with a few words. It's the state where the key characteristics of an ecosystem, namely its physical, chemical, compositional, structural, and functional state, and its landscape characteristics reflect the high level of ecological integrity, stability, and resilience necessary to ensure its long-term maintenance. So it's clear here that ecological integrity or naturalness are related in this idea with stability and resilience. Next slide, please. And the favorable reference area is the total area of a habitat type in a given biogeographical region at a national level that is considered the minimum necessary to ensure the long-term viability of the habitat type and its species, and all its significant ecological variation in its natural range, and which is composed of the area of the habitat type, and if that area is not sufficient, the area necessary for the re-establishment of the habitat type. So restoration aims at a certain quality of the habitat and a certain area of that habitat in that sufficient quality. But we can also see that there's this clear reference to a natural state that provides this good condition. Next slide, please. And we may ask whether, given the rapid changes in climatic conditions and also in the composition of our ecosystems, justifies using naturalness really as a guiding principle for restoration. There's this very nice conceptual diagram here by Seestedt. And if you look at the left panel for the moment, where we describe how restoration works or has worked under a constancy of environmental conditions, where we have in the left corner a historical reference condition. And if the environmental conditions on the bottom have changed to this reddish area, our attempt was to reverse them to the historical conditions. Likewise, on the left side of this panel, if the species composition has changed to this blue area, we would have attempted to revert that to the natural conditions. For example, converting spruce monocultures back to beech forests or removing invasive species. However, we are now in a position, and this is where the right panel is, where we have experienced irreversible changes, both in the environmental conditions as well as the species composition. We have many new species in Europe that we won't be able to get rid of. Thus, we are in a situation where we can actually not return to A, whether we want it or not. And so we have to ask, what should actually the condition of the ecosystems be that provide us with the desired ecosystem? And the new EU proposal basically refers to a historical condition without answering that question, what D should be like. And I would propose that D would have to be defined by us in terms of the kind of diversity and ecosystem services that we want from the system. Next slide, please. So I think the underlying concept is that naturalness on the one side has a very large overlap with resilience and adaptive capacity of ecosystems. Next slide, please. And I would argue that this idea is increasingly lacking evidence, that we see that resilience, adaptive capacity is only to a certain degree provided by naturalness. An example for that is that we, in the extreme droughts that we have experienced, even see enormous dieback in native beech forests, which would be the most natural ecosystem on that side. Next slide, please. It is also interesting to read in the EU law that the member states shall ensure that the areas that are subject to restoration measures show continuous improvement in the condition of the habitat types listed in the annex until good condition is reached, and so on, until the sufficient quality of the habitats is reached. And now it becomes interesting for Natura 2000 sites and outside Natura 2000 sites. The non-fulfillment of these obligations is only justified if it's caused by a force majeure or unavoidable habitat transformations which are directly caused by climate change. So basically, climate change is like a force majeure that justifies not attaining these goals. When we look at climate projections and overlay them with current reserves, we see that in temperate regions, more than 50% of the reserves that we have will experience environmental conditions they have never experienced in the past. And therefore, I believe that these unavoidable habitat transformations will likely not be an exception, but more a rule to the reserves that we have also in Europe. Next slide, please. Therefore, in SUPERB, we use an approach which we call pre-storation, which is basically made up of the two components, restoration and at the same time adaptation. And we ignore, or we acknowledge through that that the restoration of biodiversity and ecosystem services can only be partially informed by historic reference conditions of natural systems. We need to define also future target conditions for pre-storation, for example, based on projections where species may occur in future, or what species or provenances may be able to withstand the projected environmental conditions of the future. And for that, we aim to establish restoration goals jointly with landowners, experts, but also the beneficiaries of ecosystem services in the demo regions. And what the demo regions are and what we do there, Sara will talk about later. So what that means, if you look at these classical images here of how ecosystem stability and resilience is depicted, I think when you look at the upper graph, the goal cannot be to look at forests just as ecosystems, where we try to maintain them in the system of attraction and try to revert alternative states that may have reached back to the original system of attraction. What we look at forests, or should look at forests, as socio-ecological systems, where we may actually have a deliberate transformation of these systems to new basins of attraction, so that the systems there provide the services that we want, or that we stabilize the threshold boundaries of the system to ensure that they can stay within that basin of attraction. Next slide, please. Almost every forestry student in the world learns this famous saying by Jack Westoby, a former general director of the FAO Forestry Division. Forestry is not about trees, it's about people. And it's about trees only insofar as trees can serve the needs of people. And this was, of course, very much a development perspective, yeah? But it showed that really you will not be successful with, for example, reforestation and sustainable forest management if it does not serve the needs of people. And what I propose is that also with forest restoration, it's not just about trees and habitats, it's about resilient and adaptive ecosystems that promote biodiversity and provide ecosystem services required by society. And we will get there only if we view forests as socio-ecological systems. And that is a view that is currently lacking in the proposed new EU legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jürgen, on this very interesting perspective of restoration in a dynamic perspective of climate change, and also the social aspects of this. Then we proceed with the next speaker. If I have the next slide. Yeah, and we will quickly switch to the presentation on its own. That's this one indeed. So the next speaker is Harald Mauser from the EFI Liaison Office in Brussels on this conservation status and assessment. Yes, Harald, please go ahead.
Thank you, Gert-Jan, and good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present some comments on the current assessment of the conservation status of forest habitats in the European Union. In reality, there will be a mix of forest habitats in a good, unfavorable, or bad conservation status. And in a sensible approach, the assessment method we use reflects properly the character of this mixture. And also the communication on the results of the assessment will inform accordingly. What we should avoid is the effect of a distorting mirror. And this effect leads to assessment results that present a different character of the mixture in reality. And this can be exacerbated by a communication that focuses strongly on only some elements of the assessment results and neglects others. In my view, the currently used approach in assessing the nature conservation status of forest habitats in the EU, and some of the communication about it, is more on a distorted mirror pathway. There are several phases of the assessment in which distortions from the reality happen, and there is also a rather selective negative communication on the results, although the original reports are much more differentiated, including also positive findings. The union-wide assessment of the conservation status of forest habitats builds on 4 parameters for which the member states have to evaluate their status in 4 categories. One of the 4 parameters is the structure and functioning of a habitat, describing its current conditions. And like for the other parameters, a set of characteristics is used to assess this parameter, and to achieve a favorable status of the current habitat condition, 90% of a habitat area have to be in a favorable condition for all of these characteristics. Please remember the 90%. To decide on the final conservation status of a habitat, rules are applied to combine the results for these 4 parameters. And for this, the one out, all out principle applies. If one of the 4 parameters is assessed as bad, the entire conservation status is bad, irrespective of the results for the 3 other parameters. In this slide, you see some results if these rules are applied for all possible combinations of the 4 parameter statuses. It's easy for the favorable conservation status because for this, all 4 parameters have to be favorable, or maximum 1 has to be assessed as unknown. It's also simple for the conservation status unknown because for this, 2 or more of the parameters have been assessed unknown and the rest favorable. It becomes a little bit more complicated for the 2 other categories of inadequate and bad conservation status. Even if 3 of the parameters are assessed as favorable, the final conservation status can be bad. And this includes cases in which the current habitat condition has been assessed as good. These two categories of inadequate and bad conservation status comprise quite diverse cases. Bad conservation status can be with 3 parameters being favorable and only 1 bad, but this also can be with all 4 parameters being assessed as bad. In reality, this would be quite different situations in the forests, but both are assigned a bad conservation status, just as the entire mix of cases between these two cases. The complete mapping of all combinations of the 4 parameters shows that according to the rules applied, only 2% can result in a favorable conservation status, but 66% result in a bad one. Even if the parameter current habitat condition is assessed as favorable, 57%, more than half, end in a bad conservation status, only 6% in a favorable one. Ladies and gentlemen, this method itself predetermines a high share of bad assessments, even if the current habitat condition is good. Imagine we use the same method to assess the health status of EU citizens. We use 4 parameters, one of them being the physical condition of a person, and we apply the same rules to derive the final health status by using this one out, all out principle. To assess the physical condition, we could use as one of several characteristics the time a person needs to run 100 meters. And we use as benchmark 10.64 seconds. This is 90% of the speed of the current world record. So here you have again the 90%. Only very few people in the European Union will be able to meet this benchmark. The rest will not, and is therefore assigned a bad physical condition. And according to the rules, this will result in a general bad health status. And unavoidably, we will have with this approach a very high share of people with a bad health status. If we use as benchmark 18 seconds, for which there are good arguments, many more people will be able to meet this benchmark, and consequently we will achieve a much higher share of people with a general health status that is not bad. And this example illustrates how a change in only one of the many characteristics to evaluate the 4 parameters can lead to big differences in the final result because of the rules applied. And this raises the question, which characteristics and benchmarks we use for a health assessment. Do we use benchmarks that only the top athletes, the top sports people in the EU can meet, or do we need benchmarks that fit to the general population? Based on the currently used method to assess the conservation status of forest habitats, very often the communication, including some communication by the European Commission, state a general poor status of our forests, although this assessment is only on one of the many roles forests play for society. And this leads to my first concluding comment. We must not confuse nature conservation status with the general status of a forest. Forests benefit our society in various roles by providing manifold products and services. And the forest can be very good in sustainably fulfilling other roles, although it was assigned a bad conservation status according to this currently used assessment method. My second comment refers to the communication of results. This communication should fairly present all results of the assessment and not only a biased selection. And the communication should properly refer to the inner logic of the assessment method to avoid misperceptions of the real situation and to avoid the feeling of unfair treatment of those people who engage in the forest with personal labor and financial investments. How can one expect a strong commitment of forest owners and managers to engage in the many demanding and often costly measures requested by the many new EU policies related to forests, if the achievements so far are presented as bad by a method that tends to a big share of bad assessments and by a communication that does not reflect the assessment method? And this leads to the question, which benchmarks and rules are reasonable? Are these benchmarks that can only be met by largely untouched natural forest habitats? Or do we need benchmarks that are adapted to forests that are part of a cultural landscape that has to serve many other societal interests that go beyond the preservation of untouched nature? Landscape including forests that have been managed for centuries exactly to serve these other interests, and they will still have to do that in the future. You might know that the Joint Research Center currently is developing a new method to monitor restoration progress, and this method should be used for the implementation of the nature restoration law. Let's harness this time window of development phase to also discuss this currently used method to assess the conservation status and the way these results are communicated. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harald. And then Gabi is very efficient in changing back to the large presentation, almost as fast as Usain Bolt, I would say. And luckily, we do not all have to run like Usain Bolt, but then we would have a big problem. Thank you very much, Harald, and we'll come back to you also in the panel. And then indeed, the next one is already up there. So Iciar, may I invite you to tell about the National Forest Inventories and how they address the monitoring of the status of restoration.
Yes, thank you very much, Gert-Jan, and hello, everyone. I'm glad to present you the potential of National Forest Inventories to assess the restoration needs, the shortcomings, and also the challenges. National Forest Inventories are currently the main source of information at national and regional level. They have a very extensive net of field plots with permanent or a combination of permanent and temporary plots, allowing to assess the stock, but also the trends of different variables. As the objectives of the forestry sectors have been broadened, also the National Forest Inventories has been broadened the variables they are monitoring to be able to provide the information needs. Then allowing to monitor, plan, and reporting. They have different origins. As you can see in this graphic, they are repeating each certain period of years. These periods or cycles are different by the different countries. You can see it in this graph, and the most frequent one is 5 years. But they have also different sampling designs, different field protocols, and also even different definitions. So the harmonization or to make these assessments comparable is challenging, and the process selected by the National Forest Inventories community or network has been the harmonization, taking into consideration the relevance of the time series and also the need to adapt the sampling design to the national frames. In the next slide, I would like to show you the availability of the information and of the variables that are or can be used to assess the conservation status. As in this graph, I will show you the percentage of countries monitoring the different variables or indicators. And in dark green, you can see the ones that are monitored by the different countries, light green partially monitors, in yellow those that are not monitoring, and there is another one, the relevant ones, because it could happen that there are invasive species that, well, they are not really in a country, and that's the reason why they are not managing. This is the result of a survey carried out last year. As you can see, the tree species composition is monitored in all countries by National Forest Inventories, and nearly like 80% when it comes to endangered of invasive tree species, but it is less, around 80% when we come to the SUPERB composition, and less to the endangered and invasive species. These percentages are even lower for S species and rarely monitored when we are talking about other taxa such as birds. Regarding the structure, all the National Forest Inventories in Europe are taking information regarding the vertical and horizontal structure, and also they are monitoring many relevant variables that can be used to assess the structure and function, namely regeneration, deadwood, mortality. And there are other kinds of parameters that are rarely measured, but they are taking more and more relevance, and they are being studied for sure, as this is the case of the genetic diversity. And also there are other parameters or variables that are really relevant to assess the conservation status, and they are frequently assessed, like forest management or tree damages. Additional to this, as Jürgen told us, there is this proposal of nature restoration regulation, which says that this sets binding restoration targets and obligation in a wide range of ecosystems that should be measured and monitored. And for forest ecosystems, it states that member states should have an increasing trend at national level of 6 indicators. In this slide, I'm showing you the results of a survey that was carried out this year, funded by Luke, and which is showing the current information for these 6 indicators. For the first 3, you can see here standing deadwood, lying deadwood, and share forest with uneven age structure. In green color, they are directly measured or indirectly derived by measure. This can be, for instance, the equations for volume. So all countries can assess, supported by National Forest Inventories, these 3 indicators. But something very different happens with the 3 others indicators proposals. For forest connectivity, you can see here some yellow color. This means that countries can do it supported by models. And the blue colors, they are not currently be assessing. More or less for forest connectivity, it depends on the countries, and you can see here how it's different depending on the region of Europe. With the stock organic carbon happens something similar. There is a partial assessment of this, and only one northern country in Europe is assessing the bird index. So some final remarks. National Forest Inventories provides diverse and long-term information, which is useful for forest restoration monitoring and assessment. Additionally, I would like to mention that there are more and more countries assessing not only forests, but also other woodland habitats. Currently National Forest Inventories can provide reliable and robust information regarding indicators. The 3 of them entirely those ones proposed in the Nature Restoration Regulation draft. And finally, there is a need to establish a wider operational harmonized set of indicators with an assessment method, as Harald described, which would be applicable and meaningful to the different forest ecosystems, enabling to consider these different aspects that Jürgen mentions. Some of them are the dynamic resilience and adaptations. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Iciar. Very good for these insights in the role of National Forest Inventories and what they can already address and where the challenges still are. Really very good. Thank you. And then the last speaker, we're doing perfectly on time. We're very happy in SUPERB that we also have quite a large community of young upcoming researchers, and luckily many partners in SUPERB have one or two or several young researchers also working in the project, and one of them is Sara Filipek from Wageningen Environmental Research from Wageningen. And Sara will now present the rest of the demo areas and their challenges in SUPERB.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you, Gert-Jan. And as it was already mentioned, I will tell you today about SUPERB's restoration demonstration areas. Next slide, please. In total, we have 12 large-scale demonstration areas across whole Europe, which represent various challenges and problems that European forests are facing now. And our demos are divided into thematic subjects that focus on fragmented forests in intensive agricultural landscape, drought and bark beetle affected forests, diversifying and de-intensifying forest management, floodplain forest, old growth forest, but also Southern European drought copies and connectivity issues. Next slide, please. And to give you an example of how our demo looks like, you can see here the Italian and German demo. So in Italy, the restoration goal is to focus on connecting Po Valley to Southern Alps, whereas in Germany, focus is on diversifying of forests affected by bark beetle calamities. And then another slide will show you also another example. Please, yeah. Of forests in Netherlands and cross-border Croatian-Serbian demo. In Dutch demo, the aim is to revitalize the old pine forest on very poor soils, while in Serbian and Croatian restoration is focused on strengthening biodiversity of border river floodplains. So as you can see, our demo shows a variety of restoration landscapes and also goals. And to achieve those restoration goals, many actions are actually required. Next slide. So we have a broad list of restoration activities that are planned in each demo. Activities range from those which can be carried out within a stand, like diversifying forest structure, enhancing biodiversity, improving tree species composition, to those activities which are aimed at the landscape level, like improving connectivity, improving water levels, vitality of soils. But we can also not forget about including more of the social aspects, like considering people's needs for ecosystem services and benefits. And to give you an impression, the next slide will show you the restoration activities, how it actually looks like on the field. So last autumn in Romania, some of the activities were already taken care of. So you can see on the photos, basically the reduction of the pioneer species to improve the survival of the main species that will build the forest in the future. And as you can see, restoration is not always that easy, and it really requires hard work. Another slide, please. We need to be aware of that forest restoration comes also with many challenges, from which some of them are more predictable than others. We can see it that last summer in France and Spain were very much affected by forest fires. In July, mega fire ravaged about 20% of the French demo area, which had an impact on planted activities in that demo. This event also highlighted the fragility of the pure pine plantation ecosystem to a major disturbances related to the climate change. You can also see it on a photo, the difference between the plantations of pine and also the hedgerow of broadleaf which was located just next to it, and how resilient it was. For reforestation and afforestation, planting material like seeds and seedlings are also needed. However, desired tree species are not always available due to lack of suitable plants. For example, in some demos, local nurseries provide planting material. However, due to very dry summers or floodings, it is difficult sometimes to have a sufficient amount of needed seeds or seedlings. Another bottleneck related to planting species is that some countries have their own regulations which do not allow to plant different provenances of tree species than current ones. It makes it more difficult for forest managers to restore forests with a new species, especially those ones which are not native to that country. Besides restoration, it's not always that easy. Like you saw it on the photos from Romania, mountain landscape with a steep slope requires a lot of effort and really hard labor. Besides, implementing restoration requires also cooperation with many different stakeholders, ranging from local communities, private landowners, municipalities, state forests, nature agencies, to many other NGOs. And input from those various groups is also need to be considered. For instance, local communities can see forest restoration differently than professionals who are working on the subject for years. Therefore, insufficient communication between those two parties can lead to the conflicts. And what is even more important to acknowledge is that we need to take into account that forest restoration takes time, and seeing final results will not happen within a year. Next slide, please. But besides only challenges, we also have some happy and successful stories to tell. For instance, last year, we held 12 stakeholder workshops where we gathered communities to communicate and get an idea of how different actors see forest restoration. Moreover, with monitoring efforts, vast amount of data and on forest, soil and biodiversity was also gathered. And last but not least, we also wrote 13 restoration work plans, which describe in detail problems, goals, or challenges of each demonstration area. They also include information about the demo-specific restoration and monitoring activities, and provide information about the stakeholder engagement actions. And to conclude, with the next slide, our demonstrations area show a very good example of how implementation of forest restoration works and what are necessary and important actions to include while considering restoration. In this way, gathered knowledge and experience will allow us to achieve successful forest restoration in the future. And with the last slide, I would like to show you some links where you can find more information about the SUPERB's demo and also project itself. So please visit those links, and thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sara. Really very good. And now, after having heard these and seen these 4 presentations, I see there are some questions coming in the chat. And please, people from the audience, feel free to put your questions up in the chat, and Gabi, Priscilla, and Marga will make a selection out of that and also notify you when you get the speaking right. I will kick off a bit of a panel discussion, and feel free also to the panel members to step into this. Could I start with, well, for example, Jürgen, you mentioned this restoration. So what in your mind is lacking now in the nature restoration law in order to be able to deal with this restoration, this adaptation to climate change? And could this restoration really, how to deal with such a flexibility in a strict law? That is a main challenge, of course, for lawyers to put that in a text with targets and goals. And maybe you want to reflect on that, Jürgen, and then also others can jump in that. You are on mute.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, Harald Mauser mentioned the work that's been done currently by the JRC to also develop the basis for the monitoring, which means also defining the references and so on. And it's quite interesting when you look at the text. It says that urban systems and agricultural systems are socio-ecological systems, but forests are not. And that makes you wonder. You know, as we've heard, forests have been managed by millennia, centuries, by human people. We have shaped them and also shaped them for a purpose. And these reference conditions are being obtained from as close to natural, as much as undisturbed as possible conditions. And then, of course, you have to ask the question, does this state of naturalness, which is also looking backwards to this historical reference condition, does that actually provide what we want to have from these systems in future? And I don't only mean provisioning services such as timber or water or whatever, but also with regards to cultural services and also the supporting ecosystem services. And this point has been picked up by a colleague here in the chat from North Rhine-Westphalia, who said they want to restore a site where the spruce forests have died, as we have seen on the picture, not with what is being basically dictated by the potential natural vegetation, because the climatic projections show that beech forests will not be suitable, likely, on these sites, and they basically want to restore it to also a habitat type which is not part of the natural, potential natural vegetation, an oak forest.
Yeah.
And they're not allowed to. Yeah. And I think this shows the dilemma that we're in. We have a very rigid bureaucracy that is not capable to adapt to climate change. That hangs on to very old perspectives and is not able to basically pick up the challenges that we're facing. And I don't have a simple answer to that, because it's always rather challenging to change bureaucracies and rules and legislations. But that's what we have to do.
The task is big. Yeah. Could we, I don't know if this is feasible, we try to make this as dynamic as possible. Could you ask your colleague to step in here?
It was Heiner Heile who posed the question.
Is this feasible for Priscilla and Gabi to invite him? Let's wait 1 second. Is this feasible, Gabi or Priscilla?
Yes, you can now speak.
If he wants to, of course. Otherwise, we come back to this maybe later.
But while we wait for our member from the audience, this is a typical issue. There are many habitat types which are currently quickly deteriorating under climate change, where even the main species that are the foundation species of these habitat types, beech trees, pine trees, they simply die away. Most other native species also die. This is something that we experience in particular in the hotspots of climate change, for example, here in the Upper Rhine Valley or so. But this is, of course, something that we should expect will occur more widely. And we need to be prepared for that.
Could I jump in and make the connection also to what Harald said about these assessment methods? And you give a picture, Jürgen, of a very dynamic system. Well, forests are, of course, by origin already dynamic, but things are very rapidly changing now. And under even this rather fixed scheme, Harald already showed the challenges of these assessments and the simplicity then in the end on how you score a certain habitat. So, Harald, what do you think would need to change in these assessment methods, even taking into account now what Jürgen says on this flexibility on the changes that are the environmental changes that are taking place?
If I would know the answer, I would be the king of nature restoration. It's as Jürgen said, it's really a challenging question. And from my humble knowledge as a non-nature conservation expert, but a stupid forester, I think there are several aspects we have to respect. Jürgen has already mentioned forests are not an only natural system. They are a socio-ecological system serving mankind over millennia by many different services, products, and so on. So we have to ensure that these forests can sustainably provide those services we want. That can include nature conservation and biodiversity conservation, but these are decisions that have to be made for a region, respecting the regional conditions and future prospects on how nature can develop in such a region, given the climate change impacts, but also the socio-economic systems and the people living in the region, what they want. So basically, it's not to have an untouched natural condition, it's to have a forest ecosystem that can sustain existence and functionality with respect to the services we want in that region. That is not only on timber production or water, it's also including the serving nature conservation interests, even with strict reserves, where we want to see natural processes running without direct human interventions. And for those areas, we would have different criteria and parameters and benchmarks that we cannot apply for other areas where we would like to see other services. So my recommendation is to have a differentiated approach in assessing statuses, and I completely agree with Jürgen, backwards historically oriented references will not work in the most cases. We have to look in the future where the main goal is to sustain forest ecosystem that can deliver whatever the goal is that the society has on a forest in a specific region.
Yeah, could I ask one short question on it? Would it, well, let's see, if we change this assessment system and let's say all of a sudden half of or 3/4 of Europe's forests turn green all of a sudden, would that not be heavily criticized as some sort of clever bookkeeping? They changed the methodology and now everything is fine all of a sudden.
There will always be criticism if you invent a new method or change an existing method, but we should not turn a blind eye to the weaknesses of the current assessment method. First, as you have presented in your first slide with this oak forest that all are red in the map, is this really the reality?
Yeah.
And secondly, if we want to measure restoration progress, imagine you have a forest habitat where all 4 parameters currently are red. And you are able to improve 2 of them to green. You are still in a bad conservation status. How do you want to motivate people for restoration efforts if you have such a method that is not reflecting any change in reality? So I think we have to we have to be bold, given the scientific evidences we have, to improve the method and show when we change the method how the transformation from the old assessment leads to new results, and make it transparent how the change was made. But the criticism will be there anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Now I look also at we do not, we will certainly come back also to panel members, but I take a look at Gabi, Priscilla, Magda. Do we have?
Gert-Jan, I see a question that is somehow close to what we are discussing now. It's about exotic species. Should we consider exotic species to be used for restoration sites? So this is one question, and in the same approach as methodology, can we use a mosaic approach to stakeholders, mosaic of management objectives? So how feasible it is, and the public and politician willing to listen and understand? So we have here a question for Jürgen. I don't know where he is.
Okay, shall I? So first of all, can we use a mosaic approach? I think we have to use a mosaic approach because it's impossible to realize all different objectives that we have in the same area with the same approach. So we need a mosaic of forest types, forest use intensities, a mix of strict reserves and on the other side, more intensively managed areas. Otherwise, we will not be able to really meet all the different needs and goals that we associate with forests. And internationally, this has also been, described, for example, in this triad approach, but it's also, the basis of multifunctional forestry, just perhaps with a coarser grain than we sometimes envisage. So I think that may be the answer to the first part of the question. And the second part of the question regarding exotics, well, it depends. Yeah. If we can meet certain goals with these exotic species, why not? Of course, they should be species that are well tested and pose no harm to the environment, or not more harm to the environment than native species. And we do have some of these exotic species, and there are of course other exotic species of which we know that we better get rid of them or should not introduce them. So that's not a general question. It depends on the species and the purposes, and also the evidence base that we have for how they interact with our ecosystems.
Thank you. And then I look again at Gabi, Priscilla, Marta. Can we get one of the audience also as a speaking?
Yes, I would like to give the floor to Philip Hauser with a question on how we can reply to costs of this kind of restoration, and also about carbon finance in European forest. Philip Hauser, Gabi, can you give him? Yes. You are muted, Philip. No, now you are muted. Yes.
Hello, thank you very much. I was not expecting to be joining the discussion, but it's a pleasure. My question was a bit to the debate on using forests or having zero use policies. The argument is being made that the carbon stock can be maximized by not using forests, and that forests would adapt to climate change but by themselves. On the other hand, I see the necessity or the possibility to also maximize the annual carbon sink by harvesting wood, and potentially some uses would help us also to manage forests better towards more climate resilience. So how can we balance a maximum carbon stock in the forest, on the other hand, a maximum annual sequestration with wood products that can then be used for carbon sink effects, and on the other hand also avoid that carbon is released by calamities by having more resilient forests? I'd be eager to hear your thoughts about that. Thank you.
May I don't know, Sara, if you're prepared for this, would you be happy to answer this?
You can start. I can jump in with more if I can explain something.
Yeah, I'll keep it short then. Yes, that's certainly, Philip. That's also the $1 million question. Indeed, well, what we're certainly trying to do, and Jürgen also pointed at that, is through this restoration. It's well, we try to adapt the forest, make them more resilient. Well, it's basically also investing in your forest, but in a very diverse way, from strict reserves to managed systems in a closer to nature system, up to also intensive plantations. That's also part of the scheme. And sometimes we call this climate smart forestry as this broader scheme of making sure that forests fulfill their role. And there is indeed a trade-off. You cannot have everything from a single stand. You cannot have a maximum very high stock and then at the same time keep on producing large amounts of wood. There are trade-offs between that, and trade-offs which you can deal with as a manager at the landscape scale. And different owners will give different preferences, and that also creates diversity. And that will be my short answer to this.
Yes, and I also would like to add that basically all of those actions, they also have the time scale. So basically we are not talking about the short time, you know, of 10, 20 years, but you really need to consider that the actions will take at least 100 years before you will see certain results.
Yeah, very good. And I see the hand by Jürgen.
Yeah, just a small addition. I think it's important to realize that forests are not like bogs. You know, that strategy works with bogs. You can accumulate carbon almost endlessly, yeah, if they are intact. In forests, that's first of all limited. And as you have said, there is an interaction between the amount of carbon or the growing stock and its susceptibility to disturbances. And all the evidence that we have is the higher the carbon stock in these forests, the greater the susceptibility to disturbance. Yeah. And you have to ask yourself then also, what happens with that carbon? Of course, you know, it stays for some time in the ecosystem, but eventually decays and is emitted as CO2. And in used forests, that carbon would be typically salvaged, or the timber would be salvaged. And what we see, of course, in periods as we have experienced in 2018, 2019, is then when that timber is used and the market has collapsed, a lot of it does not or is not being used to its highest climate benefit, namely for long-term products. No, it gets chipped and whatnot and returns through the atmosphere quite quickly. And it would be much smarter, using the climate smart forestry term, to use part of that timber in a controlled way that also leads it to a use that provides the highest carbon mitigation benefits. Yeah? Yeah. And perhaps also through the use, basically direct a process or manage a process that facilitates the adaptation.
Thank you very much, Jürgen.
Thank you. If you allow me to follow up with a very brief question.
Yeah.
Are there uses that are superior to support this transformation to climate smart forestry, or are there other uses that are more detrimental? So is the requirement, for example, of the construction industry, which wants fir and spruce, to a certain extent a hindrance to the transformation to more diversity? And what uses could we imagine that are more positive, that contribute to management that leads to more diversity and resilience?
Back to me?
Yeah.
Or you may go.
If you want to, yeah, go ahead, Jürgen.
Well, I mean, there's not the general approach, and what we certainly see is that changes in our systems are happening so quickly, particularly with the loss of Norway spruce over large areas of Europe, that these changes are definitely not dictated by industry. You know, they're dictated by the climate. And what we will certainly also see is that there will be a necessary and strong adaptation of the industry to the changes that we will see in forests. And our forests will inevitably become much more diverse. And so will the users have to become.
Yeah, very good to point at this linkage between the industry and what in the end also happens in the forest and the forest management. But I want to speed up again because there are quite some questions now. And so I look at Magda and Priscilla and Gabi.
Yeah. We have one question from Sven Mutke. Can you take the floor, Sven, please? To ask your question about private forest smallholders engagement. Yes, Sven. You are muted.
Now?
Yes.
Yes. My question is about there are several million of private forest owners that were used to produce timber from small plantations, and that's a model that's not anymore feasible in a broad part of Europe due to climate change. How do you engage them to propose these new proposals in your moral areas, for example?
That's very good point, Sven. And this it related. Well, I want to put this on two. Sara, with involvement of it, and then also Iciar. How do we assess this for small? NFIs tend to be national, so maybe Iciar can also think about this. But Sara, please.
Yeah, exactly. So in a SUPERB cases, basically they are organized workshops when we gather different parties, different actors that are actually mostly touched by restoration. And together with them, we try to work on the restoration goal and to just present what does it mean for you, what is the benefit for certain actors, and how we can proceed with this. So basically, that means that involvement of different stakeholders have to be really taken into account from the beginning already when you plan doing some actions in the forest. In terms of what you ask about the private state owners, I think that basically what you need to have is the round table and the discussion. Okay, if we cannot provide you that, so what other alternatives, or how we can get other alternatives for you to actually sustain, to give you what you want. So at the moment, this kind of solutions we are using in the SUPERB. And maybe Iciar can continue with explaining a little bit more about how does it look like actually from the statistics.
Yeah, Iciar.
Okay. Thank you, Sven, and thank you, Sara, for the good comments. Under the point of view of indicators, it's really relevant to take into account a wide spectrum of them. So really, we are able to know what is the reality of each part, the quantity of the number of the area of the private area in Europe is quite big, and it is really fragmented. For National Forest Inventories, at times this is challenging because it's sometimes properties are really small, but this is one of the key aspects that point out the need of having a wide spectrum and considering more and more the social economic indicators that are not so widely used up to now. And yes, I think there are certification schemes, there are many initiatives ongoing now, and I think private owners are more and more concerned about all this climate change and changing situation.
Thank you, Iciar. Could you, if I see two hands, could you also say, how let's say as a private owner with 5,000 hectares, and I want to know my success of restoration. How can NFI expertise be more on data, be more local? How can you support such a person? These other developments in that direction. It's not easy.
Not easy, but additional to NFI, I would like to National Forest Inventory, of course, gives the average estimates of the volumes, the increments, the growth, the status of the health. There are many aspects that could be used. Of course, it's not at sometimes the scale, it depends on the country, on the sampling density. The scale sometimes is not the appropriate for a small user, but in the area you can have, of course, many aspects that could be really helpful. And of course, it is also, I think the production and the site index are key aspects. But I would also would like to mention that within SUPERB, we are in one of the tasks we are working with is in compiling the information on restoration projects, ongoing and past activities, and to collect the characteristics of each activity and trying to evaluate the success of each one, so that the future restoration measures could benefit of this knowledge. And I think this will be very helpful for future restorations.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And I see two hands from first Jürgen.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, I mean, the adaptation and restoration of forests is a big challenge, and it's a much bigger challenge on small private forest land. I mean, landowners that have half a hectare or 2 hectares or even 20 hectares often lack the capacity, may also lack the finance, and a lot of their knowledge, which is experiential knowledge, is devaluated quickly with climate change. And some of the problems that we had in the past is that all their management activities were often not coordinated at the landscape scale. You know, that brought us into some of these problems. If I look into the southern Black Forest, for example, here, you know, where we have the big dieback, that was 70% spruce in the landscape. It was a good individual decision, but not a good collective decision to do so. And this is something that we need to avoid when we look at adaptation and restoration. So we need to bring people together, and collective forms of management, you know, are really the way to go. But also bringing people together through networks, and I hope we do a small contribution here also with SUPERB in the demo regions to network the people to come to more coordinated landscape decisions. That's the way to go.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then Harald, but try to keep it short. I want to give some other questions also attention.
I will try. The last question on the carbon and this question on the private forest owners is symptomatic for any discussion of a specific role of forest that unavoidably leads to more complex views that are needed. Small-minded, limited discussions on only one specific aspect are not helpful. On the private forest owner question, I would remind you that private forest owners not only do wood provision, they provide a huge range of different services and products, not only the timber for the industry. In many regions, also in future, it will be possible to provide wood for the industry, but as Jürgen mentioned, this will be different tree species and assortments that we will have. It will depend on the regional condition which options for a specific forest area will allow to be fulfilled for the future to provide on one or more of the specific roles. And as Jürgen mentioned, we will need to look more at the landscape level at the region with this co-creation and co-management between different forest owners. The big question is, can we change the current economic model of forestry that is quite different than from agriculture in the EU? In the EU, agriculture lives from a high share of public subsidies. This is not the case in forestry. Forestry, in most cases, lives from free market condition under WTO rules, and the main income source, the main revenue source to cover the cost for forest ownership management, also for climate change adaptation, is coming from selling timber. Of course, if we want other roles forest owners should provide, then we need other payments for that. But do we really want to change the economic system, turning a market-oriented approach to a more public finance-based and public finance dependency? My first question would be, where are the public finances? Where are the open public budgets that we could use for forestry? So we would need to develop a huge set of public and private and mixed financing streams, discussions I have seen for 40, 50 years without any solid long-term working solutions. So yes, we will need to be more flexible. Not everywhere we can continue with wood provision, but this is really a challenge.
Yeah, thank you very much, Harald. It's very good to make this link indeed to the finance and the subsidy systems. And I'm sure there will be a webinar also on that topic. And it's very good you point at this. Thank you. I do have one from another chat question from Andreas Bolte, but if Magda and Priscilla have someone ready.
Yeah, I have, because I'm reading in the chat and at the same time I'm trying to listen to the answers.
Yeah.
So I'd like to invite the panel to also read the question, and because you have some time tagged, like question specific to Jürgen or to Sara. So please do read, and if you already answered, just make it done. But otherwise, we have a couple of questions around the selection of demo sites. So, for example, Michael Murawski was asking how we choose our. So the question is how we choose our restoration site, reflecting the classic problem of European forest. And the numbering from 1 to 6 is not a grading system. We are trying in SUPERB just to show different case studies. And we didn't select sites because they are more endangered or less endangered. It's a matter of connection and representativeness of the problem. Right, Gert-Jan?
Yeah, that's very right. Yeah.
We hope, like, we would like to cover all the sites that needs restoration, but maybe it should be considered in our upscaling program, which is also foreseen. So after SUPERB, we are really keen to upscale what we learn from these demo cases to other places, to other sites that needs restoration. So I don't know if you want to say something, Mikael?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. I'm not sure how much I should go into detail here. My question was basically just, how did you select the demo sites? I understood that these 6 problems were not necessarily the determining factor, but how did you end up selecting especially those sites, let's say, over alternative sites? Was it just out of experience that you had a list with all sites that, let's say, have problems with a certain issue, and then you just picked one because it was particularly accessible? Or was there, let's say, a quantitative or qualitative rule set behind the selection? And I'm asking this because I'm, let's say, quite interested in a similar approach. So any answer would be highly appreciated. Thank you very much.
I can quickly answer that. Thanks. That's a good point. Of course, these sites had to be selected already in the proposal phase, and the proposal was written with a large consortium over 3, 4, 5 months. And the call itself specified that half of the funds had to be spent really on measures in the field. So we had to have real activities in the field going on. And then, yeah, it was a matter of well, we have a large network. EFI is the coordinator. Magda is now the coordinator. At that time was Elisabeth Putzelsberger. With the EFI network, you have a large network, and then it's a matter in this hectic proposal writing, as it simply is. You want a diversity of ecological questions, of social questions, of financial questions. You want a diversity of measures, but also some basis that you are confident that the local people will be able to do it. And these criteria together, gave us these 12 demo areas as they are now, and as Sara presented them.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I would like to invite Lucia. We have a student with us, and she would like to ask a question also. Lucia Benavides. Yes, please unmute your mic.
Hi, thanks. Hello, everybody. Yeah, my question is kind of an ecological question, I guess. And it just occurred to me that maybe removing the pioneers, I mean, can it have like a negative effect maybe, because in the natural succession, they have an ecological function. And I was just wondering if maybe they change soil conditions or something so that then the later species then can be established. And if that would be the case, like if the pioneers have this role of kind of enabling the future species to be established, maybe removing them could have like a backfire effect, like a negative effect. Could that be, or is that crazy?
I can reply to that because it's a very specific case of the Romanian demo. So basically the photos that you saw and that reduction of the pioneer species, it was because a few years ago they planted already some species of fir and beech that they want to have in the area. And basically with the succession of the pioneers, they are suppressing the survival of the seedlings that they were already planted. And if your restoration goals aim to have this mix of forest that is more related to, at the moment, to the old growth forest that grows around this, basically, then you will try to favor your future species more than those pioneers that you have there. So that means you need to control the pioneers. And this is what they were doing last autumn, basically reducing the number of them. You're not removing all of the trees of birds that they have there, but basically you're controlling the species composition to favor those trees which you want to have it in your initial stand, your final stand.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks,
very good.
Sara.
Very good. Could I squeeze in the question by Andreas Bolte? He's also here in the panel Q&A, so he cannot put it in the public Q&A, but he writes his question: what are specific tasks and restrictions of forest restoration in Europe compared to other parts of the world? And I think he refers to a lot of restoration in the tropical areas, for example, the Atlantic part of Brazil, large restoration projects going on. So what are the European specific challenges and restrictions? I open that to the panel. Or Magda, you can also, if you... Yeah.
Sorry, I was reading question, Gert-Jan. I
No,
thought
sorry.
you are asking Andreas to...
Okay, Jürgen rose his hand.
Andreas, we cannot hear you. At least I can.
Thinking on my feet here, I think that what sets Europe aside in a way is that we have probably proportionally less degraded land where forest has been largely destroyed than in the subtropics and tropics. The estimates there are that we have 2 billion hectares of degraded land, of which roughly a third can support, say, reasonably productive forests. And so I think we have a lack of that. So there is less area also for new forests in Europe, with differences in many countries, but the competition between agriculture and forest is quite intense. And I think the other element that sets us aside from other parts of the world is that we have a lot of secondary forests that are subject to restoration, which is also not really the case in many other regions of the world. So these are three things that I can think of, but this is sort of off the top of my head, and I'm happy to have that complemented by others in this round.
Yeah. If nobody immediately jumps in, I would certainly think of the social aspects, the communities, the large diversity of stakeholders. Also, the legislations that are sometimes contradictory, top-down legislation and more local legislation and rules, the many stakeholders, the communities that may feel they may have applied a certain cultural historical type of management, but that they may feel that the forests are being taken away from them when it has to go in a certain direction. That is, I would see, as specific for Europe. And now I see a hand by Iciar.
yeah, it's related with exactly what you said, or still the historical management of the forest and having this really management shape forest, which and really visited one sometimes. So really, the society is having really an important role in this aspect.
Yeah, thank you. Harald?
Yes, thank you. Adding to that, I think what differs between Europe and the rest of the world is the huge increase of forest resources over the last 7 decades. Other world regions have seen forest expansion only since 1990 or 2000 on. We have seen this at least since the Second World War, maybe not earlier. But that means that there is a quite diverse legacy of previous land uses on those areas that are now forests, and that may impact on the way we can manage them or the way we can restore them, because the legacy of the previous land use may impact. So this is also a difference to other world regions. It makes it more complicated for the EU.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. And now I see
one more little idea with regards to that difference. What sets us also aside is the security of land tenure. And that means it's actually worth investing in restoration in contrast to many other parts of the world. So it's a big advantage that we have.
Yeah, very good point.
Gert-Jan, we have a question from Isabella to Iciar.
Yes, please.
Isabella, please. Please unmute your mic.
I was wondering, what do we know about the need for shrub species diversity restoration? Because they often are like, well, they're also here in the forest, but we don't really care. And how does shrub species diversity restoration contribute to overall forest restoration? Is it even an objective to reach forest restoration through shrub species diversity restoration?
Thank you, Isabella. I would say that it's gaining more and more relevance. I know some in central Spain, there are some restorations carried out now by the public administration, who has realized that they need to plant shrubs as a previous, let's say, step to having a forest, or at least now it's not sustainable, or they are not surviving in some parts, the trees. So yeah, I think there are not that many collected information on that, but with this new situation we have, it is more important.
I can extrapolate this here by saying like shrubs can play the role of facilitation for the higher trees, and can also be a very good source for wildlife, like for hiding, but also as food source. So they are part of the ecosystem complexity, and being there will make the ecosystem more resilient, more diverse, and more keen to support more wildlife.
Yeah, exactly. And I also would like to add something. So in our Italian demo, when you can find the information about the restoration work plan, they also focusing on introducing the shrub species among the tree species to actually also encourage and improve the biodiversity of the ecosystem.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. People can look that up. All the, like Sara included the links to all the work plans, so you can find that later in the PowerPoint. Any others in the Q&A?
Yes, we have Judith Golova. Unmute yourself, please, Judith. Judith, you are still muted.
It is also possible, well, some people have left, so it is possible that she has left.
No, I think she's still here, but maybe she has experiencing some problem with her mic, so I will read her question. What happens when you achieve favorable status at some point, but then there is a big forest fire. Do you then become unfavorable straight away, or there is some scope to argue that in some areas in Europe, forest fire are normal part of the ecosystems than other area in Europe?
Yeah.
But a general question, I don't know who can answer it, otherwise I can.
Jürgen had these disturbances in his slides. So if you want to.
I would have thought Harald, but
yeah,
it's not that I don't want to, but I think Harald, you're more appropriate on this one.
Okay, well, sure then, and then we can move to Harald.
Thank you, but I'm not an expert in that. But this refers to the problem we have. How do we include such natural disturbance dynamics that are characteristic for some forest ecosystems in the assessment of a conservation status that has sometimes a rather romantic view on natural forest status in mind? I think it's not well reflected in the process for the moment. But as Jürgen has mentioned, disturbances have to be part of the whole game in the future.
Yeah. To basically add one more sentence, what it means is that we really would have, if we use this concept of reference states, multiple reference states that reflect also on the different developmental stages of ecosystems, and not just say an old growth stage where everything should tend towards to.
Yeah.
Also, I think we can reflect on the diversity of forests, like in the Southern Europe and Northern Europe, where forest fire doesn't have the same dynamic. And in some parts in the Mediterranean forest, prescribed fire is now the trend and the way to avoid mega wildfire. And this should be also taken into consideration, like we cannot put all European forests in the same box and apply the same approach.
No, that's right. Yeah, and by origin or in the natural system, fires are especially part of the boreal system.
Yeah,
would expect them there maybe more
often. We have a question from Daiga. Yes, please. She don't accept promotion. Okay, I will ask her a question. How do you see what would be a solid way? How to define historical reference condition benchmark for forest restoration? How long time period to be considered? How far in the past to refer to?
Yeah.
So it was about defining the reference site and the historical. So it's for you, Jürgen.
Well, I think my point was actually to be more careful with historical references. And use historical references where you are pretty sure that they are actually also attainable in future. As I said, we will have many sites where the forests of the past will not be possible as the forests of the future. So the question is, to me, not how far should we look back, but how far should we actually look into the future?
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Anyone else in the Q&A?
Deira Link. Deira, do you want to ask your question? Yes, she's here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please speak. No, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I was wondering how you spatially arrange the trees, because this is kind of also really important for the dynamics in the forest. When you are planting the trees on the side.
I think her question was how physically we put trees one beside others. What?
Well, that is a very technical question, actually. And I think it's also, of course, very, as you said, per conditions, but also per country. So in the countries, they have their own specific methods, how they plant different mixtures of trees, what kind of distances they keep between them. And within our demos, this aspect, it's left to the professionals who know how to do their job. And basically that may vary from, you know, what is happening in Sweden to what is happening in France or Italy. Thus, there is no one answer to this question. And basically by involving and working with the professionals who know their job, this is the only answer that I can give you now.
Yeah, and this is certainly not. It's a good question there, because this. Well, on the one hand, we can think, well, restoration is not only planting trees, but this is about the planting of the trees. And on the one hand, we can think planting trees is simple, but it is not. It's a complex process that really requires, well, the right species provenance, the right preparation, the logistics, maintaining the seedlings when they're in the field, having your staff there, having well-trained staff. It's doing it in the right season. It's a complex process, and it should not be underestimated.
Our colleague from Sweden, demo case, Johan Svensson, is answering also the question about the shrubs. And he's telling us that in the Swedish demo case, the restoration includes planting some shrubs to improve habitat condition for lichens as a pivotal winter food resource for the reindeer that are present in the area. So yeah, it's again for wildlife or interest species in the site. Now we have a question to be asked by Eliska. Eliska, please unmute yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you for the very interesting presentations. You also talked about the nature restoration law, the new one presented by the European Commission. And I was wondering, what is your assessment of the 6 indicators presented in the legislation? I see Iciar is smiling because I've been asking this question already several times, but here are other panelists, so I would be very, very interested to hear your take on these indicators. Thank you.
Just for the invitation for Iciar, I think.
Definitely.
Okay, I can start, but I'm sure all of us can say interesting things of that. Well, I recently was in a meeting where the head of the Forest Europe was saying the indicators, a good set of indicators must tell a story. And you must know what they are saying to be able to interpret what is happening in the forest, in each forest ecosystem and in each site, because they are quite different. And when I mean, if we stick to these 6 indicators, like lying and standing deadwoods, or 2 on deadwoods, another on carbon, which is mostly litter and soil, and only we have left connectivity and birds. So I can think in a forest fire, an area which has been fired with a lot of deadwood could be very high indices, but then when you compare with other parts that could be in better status, then the indicators may be not that good. So I think I'm not saying they are not good, but for sure they have to be complemented. There are several aspects that are not taken into account. As they said several times, Jürgen, Harald, I think also Sara and Gert-Jan, they have to also take into account the climate change, resilience, the socioeconomic aspects, and these are not at the moment addressed. And of course the functionality of the, which is well, they say they are not addressed now. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to complement this? Otherwise, it was an excellent answer already. We still have a quarter of an hour and we still have a good participation. I see 67 participants. So if there are
questions, we have an anonymous attendee, but asking very interesting questions. So I have two questions from him. The first one is for all panelists. What do you do to make restoration more attractive for young people and restoration enthusiasts? Do you involve any youth organization in any of your activity to increase awareness and perhaps improve restoration efforts? Stakeholder engagement.
Yes, exactly. This is what Magda mentioned. So basically organizing the workshop where together, you know, with the professionals and local people, NGOs, you can basically discuss how the restoration looks like, what it's about. And I think especially it's very attractive, you know, when it's happening in just your backyard, somewhere close nearby. So I believe then it becomes even more interesting for the young people to get involved. I think also just participation in such events already gives a nice boost of the energy, you know, and some inspiration of what can be done. And you always also are free, you know, to contact people involved in SUPERB or some other projects, or maybe your local communities also makes let's say some days when you can go and plant the forest. Those actions are, I think, nationally done in many countries. The only thing that you need to do is just search for it.
Yeah. Harald wants to jump in.
Yes, thank you. I would a little bit broaden the scope. We have a demographic problem in agriculture and forestry, that forest owners get older and older, and we need a new generation of forest owners that are willing to engage in forestry, including restoration efforts. It's a difference if young people for a summer job do restoration projects, but it's different for those young people that would be landowners, forest owners in the future with all related costs and responsibilities to that. And to make for them forest management attractive is a huge challenge, and it's not only on forest restoration. If you imagine a young person whose forests in Germany was now destroyed by bark beetle, knowing that for the next 50 years there will not be any revenue from selling timber that the parents have done. So how to attract young people to engage in forest management at all, and not only in restoration. So this would a little bit broaden the scope of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Gert-Jan, I have the last question from this anonymous attendee asking this time. There are a lot of restoration efforts in Europe. How do we collaborate with other projects? Is there any network or it's very disjointed? What are the restoration needs of SUPERB? I can partly reply to this question.
Yeah.
I think that we are trying to reach out and to already, as Iciar said, to screen other initiatives or projects on restoration. From one side, to learn from their success and failure, and make this somehow gray literature that is in reports and sometimes in different languages and different countries available for everyone, so we can learn from others' experience. But also for other EU project or non-EU project going on in Europe, whenever we know about them, so we are actively searching, but sometimes they also reach out to us. So if you are part of these people who you know about some project interesting to be connected with SUPERB, please reach out to us, send us an email or something, and we can explore further how we can collaborate together and make ourselves more vocal and effective.
Yeah, very good. Harald has his hand up, but that may be a legacy. Yeah,
you're right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I have a comment from Stephanie Mansourian, but I will leave it to the end because it will be my link to announce the next webinar. Yeah. So I don't know if someone else had any other question we didn't address. Okay, so Stephanie was telling that maybe Stephanie, you can have the floor. It was about land tenure for private owner.
Thank you, Magda. Sorry, yes, no, this is a bit late given it was something that Jürgen mentioned earlier, but it was on the question, it was on Andreas's question about the difference between the European context and the tropical and subtropical context. And I think Jürgen picked up on one of my comments, which was about tenure being a particular issue that's quite different in those contexts. But the additional point I was making as well was demand for commodities that come from, so the demand comes from Europe or other countries, but the supply comes from tropical or subtropical countries. So that context also adds pressure to forests in the tropical and subtropical context. So those were two additional points I had thought of in response to Andreas's question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie, since you are here, and I think you cannot find the best advocate for what you will be presenting on March 8th. So our next webinar on government commit to forest restoration, but what does it take to restore forest? So maybe you want to invite, give us a glimpse about
to do some publicity.
Yes, exactly, your own publicity.
Your elevator
Okay,
speech.
well, so yes, the next webinar will be presented by myself and Mercy Durkee from Ghana, and it's based on a report and an article that we co-authored on where we explored 10 case studies looking at some of the enabling conditions, particularly focusing on governance and economic issues for forest restoration. So not at all looking at the ecological side, but actually looking at those governance and economic issues. So yes, I look forward to seeing a lot of you in a month's time.
Yeah, very good. This worked really well. And yeah, I guess seems there are no more questions coming in, or then we can also draw to a close if that's fine with you, Magda.
Yes, please, Gert-Jan.
Yeah. Then I would like to close this webinar. It's been well, the way I judge it here is that's been very interactive and very good, with very good to the point short presentations. Had a very lively discussion. I certainly also want to thank people that worked in the background to make this all possible, Gabriela Rueda and Priscilla Giordao. Certainly a big thanks to them as well. And in the preparation and in making this all feasible, with us 5, 6 sitting in different places and keeping an eye on the Q&A, etc., etc. It's a big achievement. So then I will close this webinar here and hopefully see you then in the
next
8th of March.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for our panelists, and thank you, Gert-Jan, for this good sharing of the session. And see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, Magda. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.